Aces and Sunsets by Weston Ford. The warm glow of oil lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floors of Caldwell's saloon. A haze of cigar smoke lingered near the ceiling like morning fog over the prairie. The clink of glasses and the shuffle of cards provided a steady rhythm to the evening's proceedings. At the corner table sat Elijah Stone, his weathered face revealing nothing as he studied the cards in his hand. "Call," he said, his voice as dry as the Texas plains in August. Across the table, Eleanor Blackwood's crimson lips curved into the faintest smile. She wore a gown of midnight blue that complemented her chestnut hair, which was styled in an elegant twist that betrayed her Eastern upbringing. Yet there was something in her eyes, a glint of steel and wilderness, that suggested she belonged in this frontier town more than anyone suspected. "I believe the pot is mine, gentlemen," she said, laying down her cards with a delicate hand that belied the strength of her spirit. 3 queens and a pair of tens, a full house that crushed the hopes of the men around the table. Elijah's gaze narrowed as she collected her winnings. A woman who played poker with such skill was an anomaly in Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1875, and the town existed primarily because of the silver mine in the foothills and the railroad that had recently connected them to Denver. "That's 5 hands in a row, Miss Blackwood," Elijah remarked, taking a measured sip of whiskey. "Curious streak of luck." "Is it luck, Mr. Stone?" she replied, her voice carrying the subtle refinement of her Virginia heritage. "Or perhaps simply skill that you're unaccustomed to finding in a lady?" The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor Blackwood had arrived in Silver Creek just 3 weeks prior to settle her late uncle's affairs. He'd owned a modest parcel of land on the outskirts of town. What no one had expected was for her to stay, announcing her intention to transform the property into a horse breeding ranch. "Deal again," Elijah said, pushing his remaining coins to the center of the table. The next morning found Elijah inspecting a fence line on his cattle ranch that bordered Eleanor's newly acquired property. The sun cast long shadows across the land as dawn broke over the mountains. His Palomino mare nickered softly as another rider approached. "Mr. Stone," Eleanor called out, sitting atop a magnificent black stallion. She wore riding clothes, practical trousers beneath a split skirt that scandalized the town ladies but made perfect sense on horseback. "Checking your boundaries?" "Making sure my cattle don't wander onto your property, Miss Blackwood," he replied, tipping his hat. "Though I'm curious what a Virginia lady knows about horse breeding." Eleanor guided her horse closer. "My father bred the finest thoroughbreds in Virginia before the war. I grew up in stables and pastures, learning everything from him." Her eyes clouded briefly. "After he died in Antietam, I continued his work until my mother's passing last year." Elijah studied her with new interest. "So the poker playing." "Also my father's legacy," she said with a smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "He believed a woman should know how to make her way in a man's world." "Your father sounds like an unusual man." "He was," she agreed. "Just as you seem unusual for a cattle rancher." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Your speech betrays education, Mr. Stone. Your hands, while calloused, show the remnants of a gentleman's care. And the volumes of Shakespeare I glimpsed on your shelf at the poker table suggest a man with interests beyond livestock." He found himself smiling despite his usual reserve. "Observant. A necessity at the poker table," she replied. "Speaking of which, there's a game tonight at Caldwell's. Will you be there? I don't make a habit of losing money to the same person twice in succession." Eleanor laughed, the sound as clear as a mountain stream. "Then perhaps we should play for something other than money tonight." Before he could respond, she turned her horse and galloped away, leaving him to wonder what stake she had in mind. The saloon was busier than usual that evening. News of the lady poker player had spread, drawing curious onlookers from outlying farms and neighboring settlements. Eleanor sat at the table in a gown of deep green, her hair arranged with a few curls framing her face. "What stakes did you have in mind?" Elijah asked as he took his seat. Eleanor's eyes sparkled in the lamplight. "Information, Mr. Stone. Each hand lost requires the forfeit of one true story about oneself. The deeper the secret, the greater its value." The other players exchanged glances, but none objected. The novelty appealed to them. The first hand went to a local shopkeeper, who requested a story from the saloon owner. The second went to Elijah, who turned his attention to Eleanor. "A story, Miss Blackwood. A true one." She contemplated her cards for a moment before speaking. "When I was 12, I rode my father's prize stallion without permission. The horse threw me into a creek. Rather than admit my disobedience, I claimed to have fallen while picking wildflowers. I wore that lie like a second skin for years. Elijah nodded, acknowledging the offering, minor but personal. The next hand went to Eleanor. "Mr. Stone, I believe you owe me a tale." He studied her face before responding. "I fought for the Union during the war. My brother wore Confederate gray. We haven't spoken since." A hush fell over the table. Such admissions were rare in a town where many had come to escape the lingering divisions of the conflict. Eleanor's eyes softened. "Thank you for your honesty." The evening continued, stories flowing as freely as the whiskey. With each revelation, Elijah found himself more intrigued by the Virginia woman who spoke of horses with passion and played cards with precision. As the night drew to a close, they found themselves alone at the table, the other players having retired or lost interest. "Final hand?" Eleanor suggested. "Winner asks a question that must be answered with complete candor." Elijah agreed, dealing the cards with practiced ease. They played in silence, each move deliberate. When the final card was revealed, Eleanor's flush beat his straight. "My question," she said quietly, "is why a man with your background, which I suspect includes far more than ranching, has hidden himself away in Silver Creek." Elijah considered deflecting but found himself unwilling to break the fragile trust they'd built. "I was a lawyer in Chicago. Successful, respected. I defended a man accused of murder, a man I believed innocent. I won his acquittal through a legal technicality I discovered. 6 months later, he killed a family of 4. He took a steadying breath. I couldn't reconcile being right in the law but wrong in my soul. So I left. Bought the ranch. Started over where the only consequences of my failures would be my own to bear." Eleanor reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his. "The weight of others' actions is not yours to carry, Elijah." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something shifted between them like the air before a storm. Summer unfurled across the Colorado landscape, painting the meadows with wildflowers and warming the mountain streams. Eleanor's horse breeding operation began taking shape, with the construction of stables and the acquisition of 3 prized mares to complement her stallion. Elijah found reasons to ride along their shared boundary with increasing frequency. Sometimes they spoke of practical matters, water access or grazing recommendations. Other times they discussed books or shared stories of their lives before Silver Creek. Occasionally, they played poker on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree, wagering nothing more than secrets or promises. On a particularly fine July afternoon, Eleanor invited him to see the new foal born to her favorite mare. "She's magnificent," Elijah said, watching the wobble-legged creature nurse. "I've named her Promise," Eleanor said, standing close enough that he could detect the lavender scent of her soap. "For new beginnings." Their eyes met, and Elijah felt a peculiar sensation in his chest, as though something long dormant had awakened. Before he could speak, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. 3 riders appeared, led by a man whose fine clothes contrasted with his unkempt appearance. His eyes fixed on Eleanor with disturbing intensity. "Miss Blackwood," he called out, dismounting. "What a pleasure to find you well." Eleanor's posture stiffened. "Mr. Hargrove, I wasn't aware you had business in Colorado." "My business is wherever you are, my dear." He smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Your mother made certain promises before her passing. I've come to ensure they're honored." Elijah stepped forward. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Clayton Hargrove," the man said with a slight bow. "Miss Blackwood's fiancé." The word hit Elijah like a physical blow. He glanced at Eleanor, whose face had drained of color. "A convenient fiction," she said, her voice tight. "Mr. Hargrove was my mother's creditor. In her illness, she agreed to an arrangement without my knowledge or consent." "An arrangement is a contract, Miss Blackwood," Hargrove replied. "Your mother's debts became yours. Marriage to me would solve that rather neatly." "I suggest you return east, Mr. Hargrove," Elijah said. "Miss Blackwood has established herself here independently." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Has she? Curious, since I hold the notes on this very property. Your late uncle, my dear, was as poor a businessman as your mother." Eleanor's shock confirmed she hadn't known. "That's impossible." "The deed is contingent upon clearing debts your uncle accumulated," Hargrove finished. "Debts I purchased specifically to bring you to reason." "Leave my property," Eleanor said, her voice low with fury. "Your property?" Hargrove laughed. "My dear, you have 1 week to agree to my proposal, or you'll find yourself without a roof over your head." He tipped his hat and remounted his horse. "Consider carefully." As Hargrove and his men rode away, Eleanor turned to Elijah, her composure cracking. "I had no idea. The lawyer in Denver assured me everything was in order." "How much is the debt?" Elijah asked. "I don't know." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "I've invested nearly everything in the stables and the horses. Elijah's mind was already calculating possibilities. We'll find a solution. We? She looked up at him. Yes, he said simply. We. That evening they examined the documents Eleanor had received from her uncle's lawyer. The property indeed carried a significant debt, one that her current funds couldn't cover. This is deliberate, Elijah said, his old legal instincts renewed. Hargrove has been planning this for some time. My mother never mentioned him as a creditor, Eleanor said. Only as a neighbor who expressed interest in our property, and in me. A man accustomed to acquiring what he wants, Elijah observed. But there may be a way to challenge this. Over the next several days, Elijah sent telegrams to contacts from his previous life. Eleanor focused on identifying potential buyers for her horses, though the thought of selling them pained her deeply. On the 5th day, they received word that the largest poker tournament in Colorado Territory would be held in Denver that weekend. The prize would more than cover the debt. It's too risky, Elijah argued. Those games attract professional gamblers. I'm aware, Eleanor replied, determination hardening her features. My father didn't just teach me to play poker, Elijah. He taught me to win. Then I'm coming with you. They departed the following morning, leaving Eleanor's foreman in charge of the property. The train journey to Denver passed in tense silence, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. The tournament was held in the Grand Salon of Denver's finest hotel. Participants included mine owners, railroad executives, and professional gamblers from as far away as San Francisco. Eleanor registered under her mother's maiden name, attracting curious stares as the only woman competitor. Be careful, Elijah cautioned as the tournament began. Some of these men won't take kindly to losing to a woman. I'm counting on that, she replied with a confidence that both worried and impressed him. The first rounds eliminated the weaker players. Eleanor advanced methodically, her strategy conservative but effective. By evening, she had secured a place at the final table alongside 5 men, including a notorious gambler known as the Spaniard. As midnight approached, the spectators grew rowdier, the stakes higher. Eleanor's pile of chips fluctuated but remained substantial. When the final hand was dealt, only she and the Spaniard remained. The tension in the room was palpable as cards were revealed one by one. Eleanor betrayed nothing, her face a perfect mask of polite interest. The Spaniard watched her more than his cards, searching for any sign of weakness. With the final card, Eleanor placed her bet, all her remaining chips. The Spaniard matched it without hesitation. A brave bluff, senorita, he said, revealing his cards, 2 pairs, kings and jacks. Eleanor smiled softly as she laid down her hand, a straight flush. The room erupted in chaos as the Spaniard's supporters protested. One man lunged forward, accusing her of cheating, only to find himself face to face with Elijah. The lady won fairly, Elijah said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man prepared to back his words with action. The tournament official declared Eleanor the winner, presenting her with the prize money under the protection of hotel security. As they returned to their rooms, Eleanor's composure finally broke, and she trembled with the aftermath of tension. We did it, she whispered as Elijah steadied her. You did it, he corrected gently. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I couldn't have without knowing you were there. In that moment, the distance between them vanished. His lips found hers in a kiss that spoke of admiration, relief, and something deeper that had been growing between them since that first poker game. They returned to Silver Creek to find Hargrove waiting at Eleanor's ranch house, confidence etched across his features. Your week has expired, my dear, he said. I trust you've come to the sensible decision. Eleanor approached him, Elijah at her side. I have indeed made a decision, Mr. Hargrove. She withdrew a bank draft from her purse. This should cover my uncle's debt in full, with interest. My lawyer in Denver has already filed the necessary paperwork confirming clear title to the property. Hargrove's face contorted with anger. This isn't about money. Your mother promised. My mother was ill and desperate, Eleanor interrupted. I am neither. Please accept this payment and return east. There's nothing for you here. For a moment, it seemed Hargrove might refuse. Then, calculating the witnesses present, including the sheriff, whom Elijah had thoughtfully invited to observe the transaction, he snatched the bank draft. You're making a grave mistake, he hissed. On the contrary, Eleanor replied calmly, I'm correcting one. As Hargrove departed, Eleanor turned to face her home, truly hers now. Elijah stood beside her, his hand finding hers. What happens now? He asked. Eleanor smiled, the weight of uncertainty lifted from her shoulders. I believe that's for us to decide, perhaps over a game of poker. Elijah laughed, drawing her closer. I suspect, Miss Blackwood, that in this game we both stand to win." The setting sun cast their shadows long across the land they each loved, now connected by more than just a boundary line. In the distance, Promise frolicked in the pasture, her gangly legs growing stronger each day, much like the bond between the lawyer-turned-rancher and the lady card player who had found in each other not just a worthy opponent, but a perfect match.